bitterly today. So I appreciate everyone accommodating. I'm just going to blame it on WebEx and nothing on me. So
Perfect. That's fair. Okay. Can everyone see the screen?
all right, looks good. Great. All right, well then why don't we take it away? So this also feels like this is going to go back to grade school where like you have the pressure of having to be the person to do the next slide type of thing. So appreciate that as well. So welcome everyone. As I'm Dr. Peter Martin, and so my background training is I'm a child and forensic psychiatrist, and so this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, not only in terms of working with kids and adults, but also in particular working with a lot of folks that have some of the aftermaths of this in terms of being in either type of correctional forensic type of settings, but also in the community. So, all right, next slide. A couple of things too, just in terms of if I'm just thinking of broad things before we go forward is, so as mentioned, a copy of these slides will be available as well. I'm going to purposefully go through a number of these slides very quickly. And so I'm doing almost like the bad presenter of having too many words on a slide. I'm doing this on purpose because I'm also hoping that this can be a reference for folks if, I don't know, you're feeling really inspired or you want to bore people at a cocktail party, we can go back to having those. So either way, I am purposefully, again, I will have, it looks like a bit of information overload. I will try to really highlight though what I at least see are more of the key take-home points as we go through this. And also being mindful of time. I in particular, I'm actually going to go very, very quickly, just in the very beginning portion that is going to give us just a sense of a background of talking about things like the types of abuse and the impacts of that in general, just because I imagine most people watching this have at least some, if not a ton of experience in this type of stuff. So I will try to go a little bit more faster into get into the brain stuff, so to speak. So here's just a broad objectives. Next slide, please. And so when I think about things like talking about neurobiology, et cetera, I mean, this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart also because I happen to really like the brain and neuroscience and all that good jazz. But I'm also very mindful that depending on who is listening and watching this, you might have a ton of a background in this or none at all. And so I'm going to try to at least make this be as digestible as possible and hopefully not make it too boring. We will see how we do. So next slide. And hopefully there's not too much of this. And I know that when I start to bring up, and if it makes people feel better, you know, I work with a wide variety of folks in terms of different types of training backgrounds, et cetera. I work with plenty of doctors, and most of them, when I start talking about brain and brain development and stuff like that, this is the response that they get as well. So if people have a little bit of that sense, that's okay. Hopefully there won't be too much of a shock value. Next slide. And so just a few different definitions. Again, this portion I'm going to go very quickly through. And so this is just to give a sense about, next slide, about things in terms of we're thinking about domestic violence. What does that even mean? I mean, that's a fairly broad type of idea. And actually, specifically for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to make it an even broader type of idea, which is just child maltreatment in general. And so, yes, usually when we think of domestic violence, we think of, you know, maybe for instance, like the physical aspect of causing harm to someone else, or maybe even the emotional aspect of causing harm. But really, when you have to think about maltreatment stuff, you have to also keep in mind more of the neglect, you know, the taking away of things. And that can be, even though it's a different framework than how we typically think about of violence for many times, especially in kids, that ends up being just as detrimental, if not even more so. So just to have that as a little bit of a rubric. Next slide, please. And just these are sort of more like New York State definitions for neglect and abuse. Again, probably nothing too surprising, but in general, thinking of neglect as more of taking away or withholding something versus abuse is something that you are doing to someone in general. Next slide. So some other just general background. Next slide. So some fun factoids, and I also, when I was thinking about this, I'm leery about doing too many numbers and things like that because that can also just make it almost too impersonal. But I also feel like if we're going to talk about why does this matter, a few numbers just for context or as a refresher are useful. And just unfortunately, when you look at this is just the U.S. alone, but you think about it, that every year, anywhere between a quarter or 3/4 of a million to 1 million kids have some type of abuse or neglect. And that's just a startlingly large figure when I really start to think about that. And then when you get to the next portion here, when you talk about actual CPS evaluations, as in things that rise to the level of being a substantiated claim, which, as different folks may or may not know, sometimes that can actually be a fairly high standard from the legal standpoint. So we know that there's even more abuse or neglect type of concerns that are happening out there that aren't officially on the radar. But even when you just look at that, that by and large, the majority of times when we think of founded type of cases, it actually deals more with neglect and not necessarily more like the physical abuse type of concerns, but both of those really have a pretty significant impact on child development. Next slide. And then also for Better for Worse, this costs a lot of money. And so, the different estimates include up to more than $200,000 per victim. So huge amounts. So there's a lot of incentive, I would like to think, whether you are a humanistic person, whether you're a person that cares about the bottom line, there's basically no reason to not take this as a serious issue. Next slide. And then when you just think about why kids in general might be even more susceptible to violence, kids' brains in general are basically, they're built to learn new things. Again, anyone that's been around a kid, or this just makes intuitive sense, but that is both a great thing, but also unfortunately puts them more at risk and more susceptible to different types of environmental stresses. Next slide. And when you look at things from a basic biological standpoint, basically, we have a ton of data to show that there's at least different potential effects from whether it's violence or neglect. And this can affect the body in many different ways, both in terms of, as we're going to show, impacting the development of the brain, making it not develop quite as normally as it would. But also increasing different things like stress hormones. So things like cortisol and other types of hormones that can be involved. And unfortunately, these hormones, while they can be useful in the short term, in the long term, they can lead to things like destruction of brain cells, disruption in these neural connections. And so we're going to see here a number of instances where those disruptions lead to direct problems for kids. Next slide. And also, and this is probably one of these things that is an intuitive idea, but there's also data, and I want people to be able to have access to the data to show that the more exposure and the more types of exposure to different types of violence, abuse, neglect, the worse the outcomes. And that, again, I think that's pretty intuitive, but it's more than just intuitive. It's actually proven by the data. Next slide. And then when you think about like, what are the effects of things? This is one of these slides where lots of words, I'm going to go with the general conclusion, which is that if you're looking at things like the DSM, which is our major way that we diagnose different mental health concerns, right? By and large, almost anything that's in there has at least a risk of being developed if you have a history of abuse and neglect. And yes, that's a broad, sweeping generalization. The specific disorders and things like this have a little bit more specific data. But if you want a take-home point, that's an easy take-home point. Up to the point that, depending on the studies that you look at, anywhere up to almost half of the risk of childhood development and mental health concerns is based on a history of maltreatment. It's a huge number. This is where the idea, we've all heard, at least in one shape or form, the idea of like a trauma-informed care approach. This is why that approach matters so much. Even if someone is coming into your office, whether it's the kid, the family, et cetera, and they don't necessarily meet something that would be trauma, like we think of PTSD level of trauma, that doesn't mean that it's not impacting things. Next slide. And also it leads to different types of physical manifestations. And this is going into adulthood. So the other thing too is this isn't just, why does this matter for kids? This matters for society, because it puts people at risk, at greater risk for lots of physical health things. It's not just in your mind. It increases risk for cardiovascular disease, metabolic type of concerns like diabetes. And basically, if you see the last point here, it can actually literally lead to a reduction in your lifespan. So I think this is pretty easy. I think I'm really driving the point home. This is an important topic. Let's move forward. Next slide. So talking about the brain. And so the first portion of this, I'm going to give just a really broad overview of different portions of the brain and maybe some of the general, not even going into too much detail of the function at this part. And then I'll go and talk a little bit more specifically about different portions of the brain, and we'll kind of take it from there. One take-home point that I want to emphasize is that while we're able to clearly show that a history of maltreatment leads to a problem with, you can go to the next slide, that's okay. It leads to a problem with the developments, or with brain development. One thing that's a little bit harder is that even though you might, for instance, put someone to a brain scanner, you take an image of their brain, you show that there can be differences. Those differences don't always translate to, okay, this portion of the brain is affected, therefore you definitely will have this problem. And so I bring that up because it makes it more difficult to study this type of stuff to be able to come with more conclusive conclusions. And one of the other themes that we're going to see is it does depend on the data, but there's a lot of information out there and a lot of it can be conflicting. One study might show one thing, the other study shows another thing. And some of this is that it's a complicated topic. And some of it is that we are pretty sophisticated when we research this type of stuff, but we're not sophisticated enough. And also, when you look at a population of people, you might be able to come up with a few broad conclusions, but that population-based data doesn't always apply to the person in front of you. So, all right, next slide. And then also the idea that chronic trauma and chronic stress can, while at one point it can be adaptive, over time it can become, quote, maladaptive or more of a problem. I'll talk about that towards the end in particular. Next slide. All right, so now let's delve into the brain. Next slide, please. And again, I hope that when I'm going through this, I'm not being too reductionistic or too whatever, but I'm going with the assumption that basically everyone knows a little bit, but not too much of anything. And this is also one of these things that I find like you have to review and review and review, and then finally some of it starts to stick. And I mean, I can't tell you the number of times I presented on similar types of things to different groups, and yet every single time I have to prepare for it because there's always a nuance that I'll still kind of forget. So when we look at the brain, you have to think about things both in terms of like humans and how our brains are now, but we didn't just come out of nowhere. We have been evolved. And the reason I put up this slide is just to highlight the idea that there are some basic aspects of how brains develop that's very based in from an evolutionary perspective. And probably not surprisingly, the portions of the brain that are the most sophisticated, the things that make us most human, are also the ones that will take the longest to develop. Next slide, please. And so when we think about the brain, here's just a nice, good image of the brain. And for the images that I'll show in here, I try to have them all fairly oriented in about the same way, but you might see here and there, like some of the words might be reversed, but I try to do it so visually it's consistent. So either way, if we're going to look at the brain, we're looking at the side view here. This is what most of the slides that I'll have in terms of specific portions of the brain. This is the orientation that we'll have. Next slide, please. And so when we think about the brain too, the first part that we'll talk, well, actually, when we talk about this part, we'll go from the outside in. And then as I transition to talk about the specific portions, we'll actually kind of go from the inside out because developmentally, that's how the brain develops. So if we're looking at the outside and, you know, if we, for better or for worse, we're removing everyone's skull here and we want to look at your brain, this is the first thing you'd see. These are the major lobes of the brain. This is all the stuff that, again, makes us human. This is the higher level order of ways that we think about things. Next slide, please. And then as we keep on delving in, we're going to get to smaller and smaller portions. So one part that I want to highlight of this outer portion is the frontal lobe, which literally is the part that's kind of in the front of the brain. This is where a lot of the types of more sophisticated ways that we think about things, abstract thinking, etc., takes place. But also, this is where some of the higher level of stuff in terms of how we integrate data for our motor skills and our sensory skills takes place. Next slide. And then, and actually we can even go to the next slide after this, because the one that's here is just showing that we also have a specific portion dealing just specifically with the somatosensory type of information. Again, when how our brain gets different sensory info. So delving in a little bit more, now we get into other types of structures. And this is where we're going to focus on some of these in a minute, but I just want to give a sense for people. This is the 30,000 foot view of things. So next slide. And this is the limbic system and the basal ganglia. Basically, these are portions of the brain that deal with a lot of emotional processing. They also deal with different types of like actual physical movements and our smooth coordination of things. They also deal with a lot of reward pathway type of things. So ironically, in a way, while we know that this stuff can be impacted based on trauma and things like that, we actually aren't going to talk too much about some of these structures today because this is an example where the data is kind of fuzzy and I want to tell as clear a story as possible. Next slide. And then we have a couple other specific portions that we will spend a decent amount of time. So things like the hippocampus. Next slide will show the amygdala. So these are different portions that really have a very basic connection and basic processing of emotions, fear, etc. Next slide, please. I appreciate everyone bearing with the slight delay in things too, but I guess it's good for me because if I was actually controlling it, I would be flying even faster and wouldn't be able to see it on your end. So, and then this cerebellum is a portion. This is the only slide here that I mentioned everything before would be sort of just looking at your brain from the side. This is a little bit confusing because this is looking at the side, but also almost like as if I was looking at you from the back of your head. So either way, the cerebellum, it's a little bit below the brain is the easy way to think of it, but still in your skull. And this portion of the brain deals with different types of coordination of movements and a little bit of emotional processing. Next slide. Maybe. Okay, there you go. And then the corpus callosum is, if we think about that you have in the brain, I also mentioned, this outer portion, but we basically have two large hemispheres, a left and a right side of the brain. And then the corpus callosum is, you can think of it as the highway that links information between those two portions of the brain so they can connect and talk with one another. Next slide. All right, so let's delve into some specific brain regions. Next slide. So we're going to first talk about the hippocampus. Next slide, please. And so this is, as you can tell, it's a little bit more in the inner portion. Why is it called the hippocampus? Well, basically, it's a fancy Greek term for seahorse. And so pathologists way back in the day, they weren't super sophisticated or fancy. They basically named things based on what they looked like. So that's why big fancy Greek lesson for the day, hippocampus, seahorse. You're welcome. Next slide. And when we think about this type of portion of the brain, it probably makes intuitive sense to be linked with more linkage with domestic violence because this is the portion of the brain that deals with autobiographical type of memory and data. So this is, if you think about how you think of memories, you go back to your childhood, you think of your childhood home, you think of what you're doing, those people you were with, those type of memories, that's where the hippocampus is mainly formed. So this is a pretty obvious target for childhood maltreatment. Next slide. And thankfully, for better or for worse, the data actually does support that. When we look at things, this region in particular is consistently shown to be affected by domestic violence. And some of them is because in this portion of the brain, there's a high level of those stress hormones I talked about before, like cortisol. There's a lot of receptors for those hormones in this portion of the brain. And so therefore, that also makes you more likely to be damaged. And if you think about it evolutionarily speaking, at a pretty young age, you want to be able to remember things that could kill you, right? Like that's surviving at its greatest risk, which is terrific. But also, if you unfortunately are put at risk, that might make it more likely to be damaged. Next slide, please. And so this is one of the nice things. This will be almost in some ways the easiest portion of the brain that I talk about all day because consistently we're able to show in adults at least, if you had a history of maltreatment, it's going to be smaller. The hippocampus will be smaller. And actually in females, a little bit less so. And we think that because estrogen can be a little bit protective, but it doesn't mean it's protective like there won't be any issues, but it can provide a little bit of resiliency. And we can actually advance 2 slides from here because the next slide would basically just say that unfortunately when we start to look at adolescents and at kids, it gets a little bit muddier. And basically the idea being that what we do know is there is at least seems to be a sensitive period for exposure to violence. And this is going to be another theme that I hope people are able to take away, which is depending on the age that you are, you may be, different portions of the brain may or may not be as susceptible to bad effects. And so if you're thinking of kid who's young, like 3 to 5 years old, exposed to different types of domestic violence, the hippocampus is much more likely to be affected than even if they're a little bit older. It doesn't mean that there won't still be a bad effect, but it won't be as significant. Next slide, please. And then here's one of these conclusions. Look at this. You can have either smaller amounts or higher amounts. I don't want people to get lost in the weeds. Basically, the idea is that alterations in the hippocampus have been shown to be linked with a lot of mental health disorders. Next slide. So moving to the next portion of the brain, the amygdala, which is kind of almost right next to the hippocampus. Next slide, please. And amygdala is fancily called, it basically is Greek for almond. That's it. And basically it looks like an almond. So next slide, please. That'll be the end of my Greek lessons for everyone, by the way. But if I'm trying to remember these things, these are some of the things that help me remember it. So hopefully it could be, again, a cocktail party, if nothing else. So we talked with the hippocampus. That's more of how we probably, when we think about memory, that's a lot of what the hippocampus does, more of that biographical. But memory is complicated, and we don't remember things in just one type of way. We can remember things in terms of motor memory, different types of sensory memory, and emotions themselves can have their own type of memory. And so that's where the amygdala in particular has a lot of involvement with. And also in particular, in terms of incorporating, detecting different types of stimuli that could be a potential threat. And then so facial expressions in particular. Next slide, please. And so we will, in the interest of time, because interwebs are being super quick here, I will actually just summarize the next couple of slides in the amygdala in this way, which is to say that the picture for the amygdala is a little bit funkier, unlike the hippocampus. Depending on the age that you are, and some kids exposed to that type of domestic violence type of concern, and some kids, this portion of the brain actually might get a little bit larger. Because you can think that if you are in a stressful situation, especially early on, where you might not really be able to protect yourself, your brain actually wants to learn what's a threat, what's not a threat when you're younger. As time goes on, you learn more experience, you're better able to detect what's a threat. It's less necessary to have that be so keyed up. So at least early on, exposure to stress type of hormones actually can make this area a little bit bigger in the amygdala. As time goes on, as you get a little bit older into adolescence, actually the opposite effect can happen. Now you can have some more of the negative effects of long-term exposure to these stress hormones, and actually things can get a little bit smaller. So just there's a little bit, this is again another portion of the brain where depending on the age that you are exposed to the violence, it can affect how brain development happens. So, all right, we can advance past the amygdala and into the next section. All right, look at that, cerebral cortex. So again, now we're going to talk about the outer portions, or at least the slightly more sophisticated portions. I should also say, one of my trainees at one point, I lovingly referred to some of the portions that we just were talking about as like the lizard brain, because evolutionarily speaking, those portions of the brain are pretty consistent from whether you are a reptile up to human, and I like that too. And only in terms of it highlights to me how basic and survivalistic it is. Now we're going to go into portions of the brain that are a little bit more sophisticated, again, that make us more human. Next slide, please. So, and this is one where, not surprisingly, this is the portion of the brain that's going to be the last to develop. I mean, it's developing throughout childhood and into adolescence, but really when we think about like the time that's developing most, really ends up being sort of early adolescence to early, what we consider like adulthood, like early 20s. Next slide, please. And also just with that, there's different types of cells within the brain, some which may be more or less likely to be susceptible to different types of trauma. So probably not surprisingly, to a degree, portions even of this like fancier portion of the brain, they're going to be more likely to have a negative effect from stress hormones are going to be things like your sensory and your motor areas. Again, these are the things that are the earliest to develop. If you think about a kid, it has to learn to do things like crawl, walk, etc. It has to be able to learn how to hear things appropriately, learn language, things like that. So earlier on, those portions of the brain are going to be even more, at least potentially, impacted by violence. And then as you get to later adolescence, these fancier portions will be affected. Next slide, please. And so going for pretty much the majority of the next chunk of things that we'll talk about here, I'm going to briefly talk about just some overall effects, not necessarily anything specific to a region. And then we're going to delve into some more specific regions. I will also give a little bit of sticker shock warning, which is that there's going to be a lot of fancy terms here. And I say that not pejoratively, but I say that if I had to just free recall these different portions of the brain, I could probably do it, I don't know, half the time. So again, the idea isn't that you need to know the $1,000 word. I'm going to at least try to highlight the parts that I think are interesting and hopefully applicable to folks when you're working with kids. Next slide, please. So when we think about like overall broad picture effects to this portion, there's a study that came out of Bucharest, the Bucharest Early Intervention Project. Next slide, please. And the Bucharest is located in Romania. It's a major city in Romania. And so, next slide, please. And in this city, they have many different orphanages. And so, and unfortunately in these orphanages, these are not the most well-equipped places. And so kids here, and they would go there from birth, they would get their basic needs met, but like literally just basic, fed, clothed, have a place to sleep, but they really just because of lack of folks and everything, they didn't really have a lot of what we consider typical upbringing. They didn't have a lot of physical contact or those type of interactions that we kind of need to become humans. So it's while that is terrible for a lot of reasons, it also did at least provide an opportunity to see, well, how does that type of environment impact one's brain development? And so not surprisingly, we were able to show that early deprivation through that leads to decrease in the brain matter. Next slide, please. And so, all right, we've heard before about the idea of like gray matter, white matter. Hopefully this is going to slowly poke up. There we go. So, and again, pathologists, not super fancy. The reason it's called gray and white matter is literally it looks different. So the outer portion of your brain, like if I was just going to look into your brain whole, that's actually it's a grayish pinkish color. And this is an MRI, which is kind of a half slice of your brain, but it highlights the outer portions here. That's the gray matter. So here it's, I don't know, almost tan. The inner portions are white matter. And the white matter is more of the interconnections. That's how things communicate between one another. So, all right, next slide. And, oh, it's good. Someone just said in the chat that it's been frozen for 9 minutes.
I was just going to say that.
I haven't looked at most of the chat. I was going to pause for questions and things like that. Thank you for whoever did that. I'm really glad that we'll have a copy of the slides, because otherwise you guys have unfortunately probably had to just listen to me talk a whole lot. So I'm going to continue talking, hoping that it's at least working for some people. So
it's been working on my end, and a few people are saying it's not frozen on their end either.
Okay. Well, we'll keep on moving forward. And yes, so I just need to pause too, because doesn't everyone love what COVID has done? We are now an even more technologically awesome society, and yet we still can't get basic things done. So, all right. So that was highlighting at least the idea of gray, white matter. Either way, for kids that have been consistently in that neglected type of environment, in that institutional care, we're able to show that basically their entire brain is not as developed. So next slide, please. But then in the same study, because we knew that, they actually did try to interact or put in an intervention, high quality foster care, where they were able to get these bonds, this type of treatment, et cetera. And interestingly, parts of the brain didn't change. You know, that gray matter part still was about the same reduction. But what was different was that white matter, those interconnections. So this just shows that, yes, you know, having a good attachment system, bonds, having a supportive, loving household actually literally makes changes to the brain. Next slide. So, and also, yeah, probably not surprisingly, look at other studies. Basically, many studies have shown that there can be deleterious effects to different types of abuse, whether it's physical, sexual, emotional type of abuse. And so, not surprising. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're going to delve into some slightly more specific portions. I will also say that what I'll end up doing is for the next couple chunks here, there'll be the first slide like this, which actually basically it's almost like a conclusion slide, but in the beginning. But I wanted to at least have one place where people could just kind of get the big take home message. But then the next slides, I'll actually show the portions of the brain and talk about the highlights. Just, I don't know, for me, I'm a visual learner, and it helps connect it a little bit more. So now we're going to talk about some of these more higher levels of integrating different types of sensory information. So, you know, you have different senses, right? You have what you can see, you can hear, etc. And so there's portions of the brain that will help try to make connections between all of that. And so, next slide. So we'll talk about a couple of those here. So one is the cingulate cortex. Next slide, please. And then another portion is this prefrontal cortex. And so basically, these are, again, more portions of the front part of the brain. Next slide, please. And so in these areas, they basically, here's the conclusion with what we just showed there. These are involved with areas like major decision-making, abstract thinking. You basically, if you're thinking about how do you think through a complex problem, that's this portion of the brain. So they have a major effect with decision-making and also with sort of fancier types of emotional regulation. And the idea being that when you're in a cocktail party, you are going to act in one way versus when you're in another setting, you might act in a different way. And we have the ability to differentiate the two. Interestingly, this area also has a lot of role in terms of addiction. And so, and unfortunately, we know that folks that have been through different types of domestic violence, this area of the brain is not going to work as well. There's going to be problems here. And in particular, problems starting in teenagerdom, which, let's see, when does addiction start to become a major problem? That's also during teenager times. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But it also highlights that those with a history of domestic violence and childhood maltreatment are more at risk for substance use disorders for about 1 billion different reasons. Here is one of those billion. Next slide, please. So when we are looking at different types of sensory aspects, and so the first part I'm going to break up over the next couple slides. I'm going to basically, this is the one part where we can be really specific. And in real life, there's usually not just one type of abuse, unfortunately. Right? Most people, unfortunately, have multiple types of abuse. But for the purpose of this, in these studies, they really were able to find those cases. It was just one. So, and I'm going to break it down by a couple different senses. So the first is, what do we know for individuals that have been exposed to verbal abuse, what happens in their brain? So we know that they actually do have brain changes and deficiencies in their ability to literally hear and process language. Next slide, please. And highlighting too that what I'm showing with these ones is that at least in theory, verbal abuse will lead specifically to this type of change, and then we're going to show like visual types of abuse will lead to different types of changes. That's why I'm kind of making it as nuanced. So we at least know that for folks that have been exposed to verbal abuse, these are kind of a few different consistent themes. I mentioned there's different portions of the brain that might be affected. Also, I've hinted, or at least talked about quickly, the interconnections, sort of the data pathways from one portion of the brain to the other. More and more we are realizing it's these interconnections that are affected and lead to problems. And this is true for a lot of different things, not just abuse, for a lot of different mental health concerns. So for the next 3 ones in particular, I'll go to the next slides to actually show the brain portions that we'll talk about. So next slide, please. So here's this one, arcuate fasciculus. Isn't that fancy? But not super fancy. Arcuate, literally, as you can see here, the red there, it's an arc. But basically, this is a portion of the brain that connects how we process and learn language. So folks that have been exposed to verbal abuse can actually have brain changes that leads to an inability to process verbal comprehension as well. It actually can lead to lower verbal IQ scores. Next slide, please. This other area, the cingulate bundum, which is in location fairly close to what we just looked at, a little bit more in the inside of the brain. And as we know, folks that have been exposed to verbal abuse can put them at risk for other types of mental health concerns. And there's a pretty consistent association between verbal abuse and the development of things like depression and at least dissociative type of symptoms. You know, sometimes we probably most classically see this with PTSD, but folks even that don't necessarily have PTSD level stuff can have some dissociation. This portion of the brain can be involved. Next slide, please. And then the fornix, so we're going even a little bit deeper in the middle of the brain. Here, those that have been exposed to verbal abuse also have been shown to have an increased risk for things like anxiety and somatic type of concerns. So basically having physical complaints for their emotional well-being. So these are at least pretty consistent associations with verbal abuse. So next slide, please. So now that's just a super quick snapshot of what we know that verbal abuse alone can do to the brain. So now let's look at a little bit more of witnessing domestic violence, so more of the visual aspects of things. One part that's a little bit interesting, just I guess our principle, is when we think about periods in childhood development where kids are more at risk for things. Usually this area that we have here, 7 to 13, is usually a fairly calmer time. You know, even going back to Freud and Piaget and all these developmental folks, usually this is kind of seen as just it's not dormant, but it's not a super exciting time in development in comparison to the before and afterwards. But there's still stuff going on. But interestingly, for whatever reasons, and some of this is developmental and just how our brains are developing, when we think about the impact of witnessing domestic violence, this age group, 7 to 13, actually is most at risk. And so now we can go to the next 2 slides, please, or the next slide. To highlight some of the differences. So one portion here is this inferior longitudinal fasciculus. essentially this portion of the brain, if you look at the very, I guess on your guys, when you're looking at the most right-hand portion of the slide, that it goes to the back of the brain, if I was looking at you eye to eye. And the back of the brain is actually how we process visual information. Even though our eyeballs are in the front, all the information goes back to the back of the brain in terms of how our brains actually interpret all that information. And so basically, we've been able to show that for kids that have been exposed to visual type of abuse concerns, this area of the brain will be impacted. It won't work quite as well. And what does that mean? Well, that means that they're going to have problems with things, including even like emotional type of learning. Memory in general can be more specifically affected, especially like memory of how we see things. And then it can lead to other types of problems, depression, anxiety, actually just this like idea of being more irritable and on edge. All of these things can be affected by this area. Next slide, please. And then this lingual gyrus, so it sounds a little bit like what it is, which is lingual, dealing with language, but also there's a very strong visual component to language. And so for folks that have been exposed to visual type of abuse concerns, they will have deficiencies, in visual memory. They actually won't be able to remember things quite as well when it comes to shapes, faces, etc. Next slide. So, and then the last one is when we think about sexual abuse, and we can actually go to the next slide as well. For sexual abuse, the portion of the brain that sort of higher level deals with sensory information from the genital region will actually be affected. So probably not super surprising, but there are actual brain changes to those that have been sexually abused. There actually will be a deficiency in this region. Next slide, please. Maybe next slide.
I click it, it just is.
There we go. No, it's so sorry. No. So and so the other thing we can go click through this, and then we can go to the next slide as well. So this is just highlighting the idea. Exposure to one type of maltreatment, you are more likely to find specific, maybe even more specific brain changes. But as we know, unfortunately, these usually aren't as isolated. And so the more types of trauma, the more areas of the brain that can be affected. Next slide, please. Okay, so when we think about things, you can imagine that some of this sounds bad, right? I've talked about a lot of almost damage to things, etc. But there is some adaptations to why would this happen in the first place. You can imagine if you are a young kid and you are experiencing these awful types of visual, auditory, all these type of stimuli that are very unpleasant. This actually could be a protective process. If you can't remember the things you saw, that actually might be useful, at least in the interim, in order to help you get through that experience. The problem is that, unfortunately, the longer term consequences, right? You get removed from that situation. You're in a safe environment where you don't have to adapt in that way anymore, and it might not work quite so well. And now you're stuck with more like the negative consequences. But if we're also thinking about like, why would this happen in the first place? Some of this is the body's way of trying to adapt to things. It's not just simply a matter of, like those stress hormones negatively affecting things. That's part of the picture, but there actually can be a little bit more of a sophisticated, it's not like you're thinking through, I don't want to remember this type of thing, but the way that our brains work can actually do it to help kind of protect and preserve what is there. Next slide, please. So we're getting almost towards the end of these big portions. I mentioned that corpus callosum, and we can go to the next slide, is that big portion that's sort of the highway between the two different lobes. And actually we can go one slide further. Not surprisingly, we talked how interconnections can be affected. This portion of the brain can be reduced in folks that have been maltreated. So even the ability for the left brain to communicate with the right brain literally won't be quite as good. Next slide. And then I highlighted this one portion of the brain that in theory should be very involved, things that deal with a lot of emotional and memory processing, this striatum, the basal ganglia. The problem is the studies are inconsistent, whether there's an increase or a decrease, whatever. So I put it out there as a to be continued. I can almost guarantee 10 years from now, we'll probably have a lot better understanding of this, but right now it's just up in the air. Next 2 slides, please. So that's just the basal ganglia again for folks. And we can actually move to the next slide. So this is just talking about the cerebellum, which is, again, that portion that deals with more movement, things like that. Next slide, please. And it also deals with being able to sort of process higher levels of how we think about things from an emotional, verbal standpoint. And it's been associated with other types of disorders like schizophrenia and autism. So this is probably an area too where to be continued in terms of how important it is, but we do know that exposure to violence decreases the volume of this region. Next slide. Okay, next slide, please. So now we're going to talk about some actual functional differences. And I would hope at this point that I've at least highlighted a few things about how people might be different if they've been exposed to this different type of stuff. So this is going to take some of that information and make it a little bit even more macro of some other themes. So themes that we know, that individuals that have been exposed to childhood maltreatment are more likely to have like an increased level of reactivity to emotional types of faces. Next slide, please. So they might actually appropriately or inappropriately respond to visual facial expressions from folks. All right, next slide, please. We also know, okay, so that's step 1, is that people's ability to recognize faces might be a little bit altered. They might inappropriately think that someone's happy or sad or mad at them when it's not the case. We also know that folks can have an altered just overall response to threatening stimuli. And then you'll see the next portion here. I list all these different portions. Here's one of these examples where multiple portions of the brain are affected by this. And so threat detection itself is going to be different in individuals, especially from a young age, that have been exposed to violence. And so we can actually advance to the next 2 slides because I just wanted to very briefly show, look at all these fun brain regions, but a lot is involved. All right, next slide, please. And so you can imagine again that some of this might be adaptive in the short term. If you are in an abusive type of environment, you probably want to be better at detecting threat, right? You want to make sure that you're able to sort of shield yourself from the person who's being aggressive to you. And you might really be able to pick up even just the beginning nuances of something that could be fearful. So that could be helpful when you're in that situation. But again, you might misappropriate those same type of things as you move on. Another theme too that I haven't talked too much about, but just sort of as a general concept, is that most of the time in the brain, you'll have almost 2 different ways of dealing with something. More of like a rapid sort of non-conscious process of dealing with things, and then a slower, more conscious way of dealing with things. And probably not surprisingly, but the challenge is I'd love to be able to tell people, all right, you've been through these bad experiences, you have this different type of brain changes because of it. Now we're just going to change that unconscious, that non-conscious, those really basic types of ways of dealing with things. And the problem is that our brains, we're not able to access that easily. But the good part is we are able to access the slower type of way, the more conscious type of ways. And I'll jump ahead to say though, if we're thinking about what does psychotherapy do, that's what it does. It's going to help try to bolster and work on the slower conscious type of processes to then maybe clamp down and work on some of these circuits that are a little bit more rapid. So, all right, next slide, please. And also that those that have been maltreated, they might be more likely to react quickly, but they're going to lose some of the nuance of things. They might not be able to, again, detect in a situation what is and is not a threat. Another thing, I've talked about this multiple times now, but just the idea that depending on the portion of the brain that we're talking and depending on the age of the individual, different portions of the brain are more or less likely to be affected. And also that you can have multiple different outcomes based on, and multiple different reasons, for the same outcome. For that person is impulsive or anxious or depressed might be for a number of these different problems. Next slide, please. And something that I haven't talked too much about, but we can, a lot of the same types of portions of the brain that are also involved in the reward pathways. You can think it's pretty basic human instinct that we want to find pleasure in things. We want to find things that make us feel good. We want to avoid things that make us feel bad or crappy. One of the things that we learned even from a young age is at least like how to anticipate reward. I mean, this is for anyone that's ever been around a toddler. You know, this is not exactly the easiest thing. Wait a minute, you have to sit and wait for something, and then, you know, lots of adults don't do so hot with this either, right? But in particular, in a younger kid, this can be challenging. But you can also imagine, what if you're growing up in an environment where there almost is no incentive to wait for something good to happen because you're getting bad things happening to you almost all the time. So you're going to actually, over time, have less of a response to anticipating a reward. You actually might be more likely to avoid things altogether because you just don't even know if it's going to be good or bad. So moral of the story, our reward pathways can be altered when we have exposure to that type of violence at a young age, and might make it so we have a hard time with a longer term positive consequence. And that also might make it harder to appreciate things from another person's even perspective. All right, next slide, please. So broad conclusions here. Folks that have a history of maltreatment, they're likely to not be as good at doing things like regulating their emotions and impulses, at being able to attribute appropriately other folks' thoughts and feelings, etc. And also, they might not even be quite as good at being able to see their own self within different types of social contexts. And the flip side is they might have an increased risk for things like actually experiencing internal emotions, cravings, desires, but they might not be able to label what those are. They might have a lot of emotional distress or at least turmoil, but not be able to really label it quite as well. And also, there might be a certain aspect that they are going to be more likely to do things like be more self-centered. And because they're going to protectively early on, they're going to need to shore up their own resources in order to protect themselves, but that can make them a little bit more, quote, self-centered as they get older. Next slide. So we have some lovely neurobiological explanations, but also why certain things we do in psychotherapy. So why are we trying to do things like enhance emotional regulation? Well, for a lot of reasons, but we know that these different kids and adults can have changes in their brain and their ability to emotionally regulate. But the good part is we actually have other portions of the brain that we can shore up to help improve these problems. Also, this is where you might help folks with being able to appropriately see how they respond in situations and why other people respond in certain ways, and get a little bit more of an appropriate matchup of those two things. And also maybe a little bit less of a sense of looking at less, quote, self-centered thinking and trying to work on a more empathic type of way, or at least trying to understand things from another person's viewpoint. Next slide, please. And so this is why the lovely CBT triangle, which will show up in any moment now, makes so much sense. And this is, I use this all the time. I can't tell you the number of times I literally write this on a sheet of paper when I'm talking with a kid. Why is psychotherapy useful? Here you go. You might not be able to directly change how you feel, but you can change how we think, and you can change your behaviors. And isn't that great to be able to get some control in that way? Next slide, please. And also, by the way, doing this will actually lead to brain changes. Sometimes it gets some buy-in from folks, like you are actually changing your brain. Isn't that cool? All right, next slide. So a few broad summary points. Not surprisingly, depending on the type of maltreatment, there can be so many different effects, both direct and indirect. And I'm hoping that as we went through things, it gives a little bit of a sense of maybe some more nuances, but really the impact of maltreatment can be pretty far-ranging. And just because someone doesn't develop PTSD level of concerns doesn't mean that maltreatment doesn't lead to a wide range of problems. And also, while I talked a lot about like organic changes to the brain, I am hoping that this also doesn't lose sight that there's so much other psychological consequences that I hope we keep in mind. So that's it in terms of my structure. Look at this, a whole like 3 to 5 minutes, even with technology debates or delays. The rest of this, my slides are 5,000 references in case people are really excited. And I guess since I was not able to monitor the chat, was there anything that came up in the remaining few moments?
There was nothing that came in as questions to this point yet.
It's because everything was so crystal clear that everyone's like, this is just the most amazing presentation I've ever seen. There's not a question in the world. No, I know it's a lot of information. I appreciate everyone too bearing with some technological breaks, etc. This would be, I would love to do this in person. It'd be far smoother, but I think we at least persevered. And as I said, people do have questions that they think of things, feel free to email me. I'm happy to try to answer.
Thank you, Dr. Martin.
We do have one question that came in it says, can you talk on how a parent's history of abuse could affect the child's development?
That's yes, this is one of these like really easy and really impossible questions at the same time. So you're not, we're talking here not necessarily the kid themselves, but just the parents. They come in, they have their own history of abuse. How is that impacting things? So part of a lot of times what I'll end up doing with this type of kid or family is using that hopefully advantageously, but also as a way to connect with the family, to say that for yourself, mom or dad or whatever, you went through these different types of experiences. First of all, I can only imagine what that was like for you, but also it's not surprising, because probably not surprisingly, a lot of times folks that have been through that have different parenting styles that might be plus minus of what we might ideally want. And so I'll use that in a way to say, like, so I am not surprised to hear that when you are frustrated, upset, whatever, this is the way that you have tried to do things. And I imagine it's probably worked sometimes, but I imagine times too that it hasn't worked out so well at all either. And so that's something that we can try to work on, is learning just alternate ways of dealing with the same thing. I might also start to say, we have evidence that if a parent has been through that type of abuse, I mean, literally that can lead to changes in their genome. And so in their genetic structure, and some of that we're able to show actually can be sort of passed down to the next generation. Not always, but there's a little bit of that aspect. And I say that not in a way like you have doomed your own kid because of what you've been through, but more of those type of changes can have longer term impacts. But the good thing is, again, we have a number of ways to try to help with that. It just means that your son or daughter is more at risk for certain concerns. So I usually end up kind of phrasing in that way. I mean, the challenges with any of these things, it's hard to say you went through this, so therefore your kid's going to have this. And so I will purposely talk about things in broader strokes, but also with the idea of informing, but also trying to help shore up support and hope in the kid and the family. All right, I guess we are literally at 1 o'clock. So unless there's anything else, and as I said, I'm happy to, okay. So if there is anything else, I said, I'm happy to answer any questions in the future. And it's been a pleasure, and I'm glad that we're able to do this, and thank you for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Martin. This was fantastic. So I would like to just make a quick comment that if you're interested in hearing more from Dr. Martin about this, maybe a little slower or a little more in depth, I'm very interested in understanding how to work with folks who have these brain impacts and helping them move forward. But if others have other things they'd be interested in, please note that in the evaluation. Okay, so I pasted a link to the evaluation in the chat box. Please complete that so we can continue to make this better. I also posted the link for the October session in the chat box. So hope to see you then. You're welcome to check out all of the other trainings that we facilitated in the Erie County Workforce Collaborative Training Series at erie.gov/mental health. Again, if you're interested in being a presenter, let me know, or if you have ideas for topics you'd like to learn more about, I'd like to know that too. Thank you again, Dr. Martin. Thank you all for being here, and have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.